Sir, the flight attendant's voice sliced through the calm cabin like a sudden drop in altitude, sharp and rattling. This section is reserved for business class passengers only. Either you take your seat in economy like you're supposed to, or I'll have security escort you off the plane. Is that clear? Her tone wasn't just firm. It was laced with something colder, something that said she wasn't just enforcing rules. She was making a point. Passengers in nearby rows stopped what they were doing. A man lowered his newspaper. A woman clutched her designer purse a little tighter. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin of Global Skies Flight 162 changed in an instant. Every eye now turned toward one man, a tall black gentleman seated quietly in 2A, dressed in a plain navy polo, dark jeans, and leather sneakers. He looked calm, completely still. As if this wasn't the first time someone had tried to publicly diminish him. He didn't speak. Not yet. But the fire in his eyes said more than words could. The entire cabin went quiet, waiting to see what he'd do. And no one, not even the flight attendant herself, had any idea who he really was or what was coming next. Daniel Moore wasn't a typical passenger, but that day he dressed like one. No suit, no Rolex, no entourage. He walked onto Global Skies Flight 162 out of LAX alone, carrying only a leather laptop bag and a paperback novel he hadn't yet opened. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed, his posture upright, his movements deliberate. To the untrained eye, he could have been anyone. A teacher heading to a conference, maybe a consultant flying to pitch a mid-sized firm. But Daniel Moore was none of those things. He was the CEO and largest private shareholder of Global Skies Airlines, the very airline whose crew was now side-eyeing him. And that seat 2A was his, not just on the manifest, but metaphorically. He designed the lay, but Daniel wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to observe. It was less than 4 minutes later when the lead flight attendant, Ashley Reynolds, made her approach. She looked composed, but Daniel caught the flicker in her expression, the double take, the slight narrowing of the eyes. She didn't greet him, didn't ask for a drink order. Instead, she leaned in and said with restrained politeness, "I think there might have been a mistake with your seat." "Sir, do you have your boarding pass?" Daniel handed it over without a word. She glanced at it, paused, then looked back at him, her smile strained. "Okay. Interesting." Her voice drifted, and then came the moment that changed the entire flight. She stepped back, folded her arms, and said just loudly enough for the nearby passengers to hear that infamous line, "This section is reserved for business class passengers only. Either you move to the back of the plane, or I'll have you removed by security." She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull him aside. She said it out loud in front of everyone. And in that moment, Daniel knew this wasn't about a seat. It never was. He glanced around the cabin. Gregory Lang shifted in his seat with visible satisfaction. A woman in row 3 clutched her pearls, and the silence that followed was the kind that buzzed, a silence that wasn't empty, but full of things no one wanted to say. Daniel took a breath, reached calmly into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just typed a brief message to someone at corporate. 6 words. Code Blue, Gate 22, immediate response. Then he placed the phone back in his lap and looked up at Ashley Reynolds, still standing above him, still waiting for him to fold. But Daniel Moore didn't fold. Not that day. Not ever. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to feel in your chest. Ashley Reynolds still stood over her, Daniel with arms crossed and lips pressed tight, like she was waiting for a command to be obeyed, not a question to be answered. Daniel, composed as ever, returned her gaze without a word. Not in defiance, but in patience. The kind of patience that comes from decades of having to swallow assumptions before breakfast. He knew what was happening. Had lived through different versions of it his entire life. Just never this blatant, never this public, and never from an employee of his own airline. Across the aisle, Gregory Lang leaned back with a satisfied smirk, legs crossed and eyes gleaming like a man who just saw the world reaffirm his status. Row by row, the energy shifted. Some passengers looked away. Others pretended not to hear. But everyone felt the imbalance, that sharp divide between those who were allowed to belong and those who were told they didn't. Ashley glanced at Daniel's boarding pass once more, her tone tightening. "Are you sure this isn't someone else's pass?" she asked, voice laced with disbelief. "Because, you weren't on the upgrade list. We didn't see your name at check-in." Daniel looked her in the eye and finally spoke, his voice low, steady. "It's mine. The seat, the pass, all of it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight in his words carried more authority than volume ever could. Ashley opened her mouth to say something else, maybe an apology, maybe another challenge, but stopped cold when a younger attendant approached her side. Sophia Grant, 31, quiet, thoughtful, and fairly new to Global Skies, had been watching from the galley. She leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "I double-checked the manifest. He's listed in 2A. Full fare, no upgrade. He paid." Ashley blinked. "Paid?" "Yes." Sophia nodded. "In full. No flags. Everything's cleared." Ashley's face tightened, not with clarity but frustration. For a long second she said nothing, just stared at Daniel like he was a riddle she couldn't solve. And that's when Gregory Lang chimed in again, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, maybe next time you people can try sitting where you're supposed to instead of making a scene." The words hit like a slap. Sophia's jaw tensed. The woman in row 3 visibly recoiled. And Daniel? He just sat there as still as before, hands folded on his lap. But something in his expression shifted, a flicker of cold calculation behind his calm. It was at that moment that Daniel's phone buzzed softly. He glanced down, read the name on the screen, Marcus Tate, VP of Corporate Relations, and placed the phone face down beside him. Across the aisle, Sophia caught the movement and subtly leaned in. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her voice sincere, human. Daniel nodded. "Yes, thank you." Then, with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes, he added, "Let's just say I won't be needing the in-flight entertainment today." Sophia offered the slightest smirk, but behind her eyes was concern. She could feel something was coming. Something bigger than a seating dispute. Back at the front of the cabin, Ashley walked briskly toward the flight deck. Moments later, the cockpit door cracked open and out stepped Captain Ron Becker, mid-40s, composed, even-tempered, and used to dealing with logistical flare-ups. He scanned the cabin quickly and made eye contact with Ashley. "What's the issue?" he asked. "Passenger in 2A is refusing to comply with a seat reassignment. Manifest is unclear." Ashley kept her tone neutral, but her eyes gave away her urgency. "We need to resolve this before pushback." Captain Becker nodded and began walking the aisle. As he approached 2A, Daniel rose slowly, calmly, not in protest, but with the kind of self-assurance that said, "I have nothing to prove, but you need to understand who you're speaking to." "Good afternoon, Captain," Daniel said. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Becker extended his hand, measured. "Let's clear it up then. Do you have ID?" Daniel didn't flinch. He reached into his wallet and handed over a plain black business card. No flashy gold lettering, no embossed edges, just his name, Daniel Moore, and beneath it, Chief Executive Officer, Global Skies Airlines. Becker took a moment, read it, then looked up, visibly startled. His tone changed instantly. "Mr. Moore, But Daniel raised a hand. "Let's not make a scene, Captain. I've already sent word to corporate. Your job now is to keep this cabin calm while we handle things at the gate." Becker nodded quickly, stunned, and turned toward the cockpit without another word. Meanwhile, in the rear galley, Sophia received a quiet ping on her internal crew comm. "Hold boarding. Do not close the main door." At Gate 22, the jet bridge operator received the same call. Just outside, a black SUV pulled up with tinted windows. Marcus Tate stepped out, dressed in a sharp gray suit, a Bluetooth in one ear, and a determined look on his face. Within seconds, he was through security and stepping onto the jet bridge with two uniformed airport supervisors in tow. Back in the cabin, Ashley had returned to the aisle, now sensing something was very, very wrong. She turned toward the front just as Marcus entered. The moment she saw him, her posture stiffened. He looked around, spotted Daniel, then addressed the cabin, calm but authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. There has been a procedural issue that requires attention before departure. We appreciate your patience." Then he turned to Daniel and lowered his voice. "I came as fast as I could." Daniel gave a slight nod. "Let's resolve this privately. Then we'll decide what happens next." Ashley watched in stunned silence as the two men walked toward the front of the aircraft with the gate staff, for two. A first time, the balance of power in the room shifted, not with anger, not with shouting, but with quiet, undeniable authority. Sophia followed behind, catching Ashley's eye for just a second. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look said enough. "You just messed with the wrong man." And from here on out, this flight was headed somewhere no one expected. For a long stretch, no one said a word. The cabin remained still, suspended in that strange silence that only happens when people realize they've witnessed something bigger than just a delay. Passengers murmured quietly behind their hands, stealing glances toward the front where Daniel Moore had just stepped off the plane with Marcus Tate and two senior gate managers. Inside the jet bridge, the conversation was brief but direct. Daniel didn't raise his voice, didn't show a flicker of anger. He simply laid out the facts. He had boarded the flight anonymously on purpose. He had paid full fare for a seat in business class. He had complied with every airline policy. And yet, based solely on appearance, his clothing, his skin, his silence, he had been challenged, questioned, and publicly humiliated by someone on his payroll. "I didn't come here to flex authority," Daniel said quietly. "I came to see if the reports I've been reading are just isolated incidents or a pattern. What happened today?" "That's a pattern." Marcus nodded, jaw tight. He had only recently stepped into the VP role and had already started pushing for culture training at the crew level. "We can ground the flight now, sir," he offered. "Swap the staff, delay departure, or—" "No," Daniel interrupted. "Not yet. Let's go back in. I want to see who speaks up and who stays silent." He turned and, with a calmness that belied the gravity of the moment, stepped back into the cabin. Every head turned as Daniel re-entered, this time followed by Marcus and one of the airport officials. Ashley, now visibly pale, stood frozen near the galley. Her voice was gone. She didn't offer another. Her word, didn't approach, didn't apologize. She had seen the shift in body language the moment Marcus had walked on board, had watched how Daniel had carried himself without explanation. And now she understood. She had humiliated the man who signed the checks, who shaped the policies, who had the power to rebuild this entire airline from the inside out. But still, she said nothing, not even a whisper. Daniel walked back to seat 2A slowly, like a man claiming what was always rightfully his. Sophia was standing nearby and stepped aside respectfully. "Mr. Moore," she said gently, "can I get you something to drink?" Daniel gave her a small nod. "Water, please. Room temperature." She disappeared without a fuss. Across the aisle, Gregory Lang no longer wore his smug grin. He shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie like the air had suddenly gotten thicker. He didn't meet Daniel's eyes. Not anymore. A few rows behind, a middle-aged Asian woman, Linda Chu, leaned slightly into the aisle and said clearly enough for the cabin to hear, "I want to say thank you, sir, for how you handled all that." Daniel glanced back and met her eyes. There was kindness in her voice, but more importantly, conviction. "No one should be treated like that," she added. "Not here, not anywhere." Her words hung in the air for a moment. Then another passenger, a younger man in business attire, chimed in, "Yeah, that wasn't right. You handled that with real grace." Others nodded. The quiet had shifted. No longer tense, but reflective. People were beginning to feel something else now. Guilt, perhaps. Awareness? A few were wondering if they'd ever spoken up in similar moments. Most knew they hadn't. Ashley, standing by the bulkhead wall, opened her mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to defend herself. But before any words came out, the forward phone rang. Sophia picked it up, listened for a moment, then turned to Ashley. "Captain wants to see you up front," she said quietly. Ashley didn't argue. She just nodded and walked toward the cockpit. The door closed behind her, and for several minutes, she didn't return. When she did, her face was pale, jaw clenched, and her eyes didn't meet anyone else's. She disappeared into the galley, and from that point on, didn't re-enter the cabin again. Daniel sipped his water and took out the paperback novel he'd brought, one he knew he wouldn't get to read. But still, the act of opening it made a point. He was staying, calmly, firmly, and nothing about what had happened would force him to move. As he flipped to the first page, Sophia leaned down beside him. "Mr. Moore," she said softly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were, but even if you were just a regular passenger, none of that should have happened." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were glassy. Daniel looked up at her. "I know you didn't speak up at first," he said, "but you checked the manifest. You came back. That matters." She nodded once and returned to her duties. And then, just as the cabin started to settle, Gregory Lang, the same man who earlier had smirked and muttered, leaned over. "Look," he began awkwardly. "I didn't mean anything by it earlier. It's just, well, this world's gotten so sensitive. You know how it is." Daniel didn't look up, didn't reply. He just turned the page of his book. And then something unexpected happened. The forward intercom crackled on and the captain's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we taxi out, I want to personally acknowledge and apologize for the delay and for any unprofessional behavior experienced by any passenger today. At Global Skies, we are committed to respect, safety, and equality for all passengers, regardless of what they wear, where they sit, or what they look like. Thank you for your understanding." The message ended. Several passengers looked around. Some nodded. Others clapped softly at first, then with growing confidence. Daniel closed his book, not because he was finished reading, but because the story around him had just taken a turn. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane finally prepared to push back from the gate, but the air inside that first-class cabin hadn't relaxed. People were still digesting what they'd just witnessed. Some were clearly uncomfortable, not with Daniel Moore's presence, but with the mirror this moment had just held up to their own silence. Others stole glances at him like he was something more than just a man reading a book. And he was. Not that they knew it yet. Most still didn't realize who he really was. To them, he was just a sharply composed black man who'd held his ground and somehow managed to turn the entire power structure of the cabin upside down without ever raising his voice. But that was about to change. Moments after the captain's announcement echoed through the speakers, the cabin door reopened briefly, something that almost never happens once the flight crew seals the cabin. A uniformed Global Skies ground manager stepped on board, holding a folder and walking briskly to the front without a word. He handed it to Sophia, who gave a quick nod and took a breath before walking over to where Daniel sat. "Mr. Moore," she said softly, "the captain and Mr. Tate would like to know if you'd prefer to deplane and take a private flight to Chicago. We can have a jet ready in 25 minutes. Daniel looked up, set his book down on the tray table, and gave the most unexpected answer of the day. "No," he said. "I'll be staying on this flight, in this seat, with these people, if it's all right with you." His voice was warm but firm. Sophia gave a quiet smile. "Yes, sir. It's more than all right." But not everyone was smiling. A passenger in row 1 leaned sideways to whisper something to her husband. Gregory Lang shifted again, now visibly uncomfortable, as if still trying to reconcile what he'd seen with what he'd assumed. Ashley, still hidden in the galley, peeked through the curtain just briefly before vanishing again, her presence almost ghost-like now. The power she once had completely evaporated. But for Daniel, it wasn't about punishment. It never had been. He wasn't interested in public humiliation. What he wanted, what he needed, was for people to see what bias looked like when no one expected it, to feel the tension of witnessing it in real time, and to remember how easy it is to stay silent until it's your seat that's questioned. The wheels of the plane finally began to roll, and as the jet eased away from Gate 22, Daniel leaned back in his seat, fingers resting lightly on the book still open in his lap. His phone buzzed once. A message from his daughter, Olivia, popped up on screen. "Text me when you land. I'm waiting at arrivals." He smiled at the simplicity of it. She didn't know what had happened yet. She just wanted to see her father. And in that moment, Daniel wasn't a CEO or a test case or a quiet protest. He was just a dad heading home to his kid. He replied with a single word, "Soon." Meanwhile, back at corporate, news of the incident had already reached the executive team. A junior analyst who had been at the gate recorded a short clip of the flight attendant's confrontation and posted it anonymously to an internal channel. Within 30 minutes, the video was already circulating beyond headquarters, and by the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Daniel's name was trending, not as a public figure, not yet, but as a quiet hero who had shown restraint where outrage was expected. In seat 3B, a tech entrepreneur browsing LinkedIn recognized it, at the name on the business card Daniel had handed the captain. He turned to the man next to him and whispered, "That's not just a regular passenger. That guy runs the whole airline." His neighbor's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" The ripple started there. Whispers that spread across rows. Some passengers pulled out their phones to Google his name. Others exchanged knowing looks. Bit by bit, the pieces came together, and with every moment, Daniel's presence in 2A became heavier, more powerful. He hadn't changed, but how they saw him had. The plane had settled into cruise, but the cabin hadn't truly relaxed. Not yet. Tension still lingered in the corners, soft but unmistakable. The air was quieter now, almost reverent, like the passengers knew they'd just witnessed something unusual, something worth remembering. But for Daniel Moore, the moment of exposure had passed. Now came the part that mattered most, the response. Sitting calmly in 2A, he retrieved his phone again. There were already 4 voicemails, a dozen text messages, and a flagged email from the airline's legal team. But one message stood out. A note from his assistant with just 4 words, "The board is watching." Daniel locked the screen. He wasn't here to posture for the board. He wasn't here to punish people either. He was here because something had been rotting quietly inside his company, and it had just shown itself in the most public, undeniable way. He had the evidence now, and it was time to act. Not after the flight landed, but right here in real time. He turned to Sophia as she passed and asked softly, Could you ask the captain if I might have a word with him? Just 5 minutes in private. Sophia paused for a second, nodded without a word, and walked toward the cockpit. 2 minutes later, the door opened. The captain appeared, composed, respectful. "Mr. Moore, we can step into the forward galley if that's all right." Daniel rose without drama and followed. Inside the small galley, Captain Ron Becker stood with his hands behind his back. He wasn't defensive. He looked thoughtful. "Sir," he began, "I want to say first that I'm deeply sorry for what happened. I should have handled it differently the moment I stepped into the cabin." Daniel held up a hand. "Captain, I'm not here for apologies. I've had a lifetime of them. I'm here for clarity." The captain nodded slowly. "You have it, sir. It won't happen again." "That's not good enough," Daniel said gently but firmly. "Because what happened to me today? It happens to people who don't sit in this chair. People who don't have my title. The problem isn't just a bad apple. It's the barrel." Becker swallowed hard. "I understand." Daniel looked him square in the eyes. "Do you?" The question hung in the narrow space between them. Not accusatory, but challenging. The kind of question that forces a man to look inward. Becker's voice dropped. "I think I do now." Daniel leaned slightly against the galley counter, arms folded. "Here's what's going to happen," he said calmly. "When we land, you'll file a full incident report, not just on passenger conduct, but on crew judgment. I want a complete timeline, every decision, every statement, names if needed. This will go directly to the audit team." "Understood." "And Captain," Daniel added, "don't protect anyone out of loyalty. Loyalty without accountability is just cover." Becker gave a slight nod. "Yes, sir." With that, Daniel offered his hand. Becker shook it firmly, respectfully, and Daniel returned to his seat. Once seated, Daniel took a deep breath and reached into his laptop bag. He pulled out a small leather notebook. No logo, just worn edges and the feel of something lived in. Inside were handwritten notes from the past 6 minutes. Quotes from passengers, specific flight numbers, even internal emails from crew members who had reached out in confidence, afraid to speak up publicly. These weren't just scattered stories. They were symptoms. And Daniel knew better than most. When an organization begins to ignore the quiet, it eventually answers to the loud. He flipped to a clean page and began writing immediate action items. Flight 162. Incident: full internal audit of crew conduct over the past 90 days. Emergency ethics and equity retraining. Mandatory for all frontline staff. Launch Speak Freely. Anonymous hotline for reporting bias or mistreatment. Issue a formal apology to affected passengers. Public and not buried in PR jargon. Suspend the lead flight attendant pending internal review. Promote and reward staff who showed integrity under pressure, like Sophia Grant. Internal memo to all employees: silence is complicity. As he wrote, the mood in the cabin softened further, not because people had forgotten what happened, but because they were beginning to absorb it. One older couple, seated in 4A and 4B, leaned toward Daniel as he finished his notes. The woman, gray-haired with kind eyes, said gently, "I just want to say thank you. Not everyone would have stayed so composed." Daniel nodded, closing his notebook. "Sometimes dignity is the loudest thing in the room." She smiled. "You taught us something today." "I didn't come here to teach," he replied. "I came here to see who we really are. We've got work to do." The wheels touched down in Chicago with a firm, steady thud, and for a moment, everything was still. That breathless second where the entire plane seemed to exhale together. But for Daniel Moore, it wasn't relief he felt. It was focus. The moment he'd planned for, the reason he took that seat in 2A to begin with, was about to unfold. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the energy in the cabin shifted again. This time, not from tension, but anticipation. News had spread. Whispers had turned into quiet confirmations. "That's the CEO of the whole airline," one passenger murmured. Another added, "The guy they tried to move, he owns the plane we're sitting on." Daniel didn't respond to any of it. He simply sat in the same calm posture he had held from the start, watching as the terminal rolled past the windows. A soft chime rang overhead. The captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. On behalf of Global Skies, thank you for flying with us." It was the standard language, but nothing about this landing was standard. As the jet bridge connected and the seatbelt sign clicked off, passengers rose slowly. No one rushed to the aisle. Eyes lingered on Daniel as he remained seated, waiting. Sophia approached and leaned in gently. "Sir, Mr. Tate is waiting at the door with airport security. The media is at the terminal." Daniel closed his notebook and stood. "Let's keep it quiet," he said. "I'm not interested in spectacle." She nodded. "Understood." And then, with quiet authority, Daniel stepped into the aisle. Passengers parted for him without a word, not because he asked, but because something in them had shifted. This wasn't a man who demanded respect. This was a man who carried it with him. One by one, people offered nods. One woman said softly, "Thank you for holding your ground." A man in 3B murmured, "That meant something." Another just placed a hand over his heart as Daniel passed. He nodded to each of them, not as a celebrity, not as a powerful executive, but as a fellow human being who had stood his ground in the face of quiet humiliation. And now it was time to turn that moment into change. At the front of the jet bridge, Marcus Tate stood waiting with two airport officials. His face was drawn but composed. "Sir," he said as Daniel stepped off the plane, "we've got a press pool waiting beyond security. Your call. We can redirect them or—" "Let them wait," Daniel said. "I need 10 minutes." He walked straight into a private conference room down the corridor where a small team from corporate had assembled. Legal counsel, PR director, HR chief, all standing, all silent. Daniel stepped to the head of the table, loosened his collar, and looked around. "First, you don't speak. You listen." A few shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. "What happened on Flight 162 isn't a one-time mistake," he continued. "It's the symptom of a culture problem we've ignored too long. So from this moment forward, we're not just managing optics, we're leading transformation." He reached into his bag and pulled out the leather notebook, flipping to the action list. "We launch a company-wide initiative. Today, it will be called the Skyline Protocol." For the next 10 minutes, Daniel laid out his vision, not just as a reaction, but as a rebirth. Mandatory equity and bias training for all flight and ground crew. A permanent anonymous reporting platform for discriminatory behavior. A full staffing review of customer-facing employees. And most of all, a promise that Global Skies would be a place where no one would ever be told to move to the back based on how they looked. By the time Daniel stepped into the press area near the arrivals gate, the camera lights were already on. But he didn't stand on a podium. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood beside Marcus, looked into the crowd, and spoke directly and quietly. "Yes, I was the passenger in seat 2A. Yes, I was misjudged, ignored, and told to move to the back of the plane. But this story isn't about embarrassment. It's about responsibility. I lead a company that serves millions of people, and today I saw firsthand what some of them experience. So from this moment forward, Global Skies will do better, not with empty apologies, but with action, policy, and accountability. That's my promise. Not just as a CEO, but as a man who refuses to stay silent." And with that, he turned, walked away from the microphones, and disappeared into the crowd. Daniel spotted his daughter before she saw him. Olivia stood by the escalators at Gate 6, holding her phone in one hand and a to-go coffee in the other, scanning the crowd with that same quiet intensity she'd had since she was a little girl. She was 27 now, working in nonprofit law, full of fire and heart. When her eyes landed on him, her whole face lit up. She walked fast, didn't run, didn't make a scene. But when she reached him, she hugged him tight. No words at first, just a long silence between a daughter and the father she'd always admired. Finally, she pulled back and looked up at him. "You okay?" Daniel nodded, his voice low. "I am now." She gave him a knowing smile. "I read the statement. You didn't hold back." "I couldn't," he said. "Not this time." They started walking side by side, slow and steady. "It's been coming for a while," Olivia said. "You've seen it. You've heard it. You just hadn't lived it that directly yet." Daniel exhaled, not as a sigh, but as release. "That's the part that hurts," he said. "I built this company from the ground up. I believed if I led with integrity, that would trickle down. But I forgot. Culture doesn't trickle. It's built layer by layer, day by day, and if you don't shape it deliberately, someone else will." Olivia nodded slowly. "So now what?" she asked. "Ked, what happens next?" Daniel paused, looked around the terminal, then back at her. "We start over. Not from scratch, but from the truth. And we lead differently. I'm not interested in platitudes. I want policies. I want protections. And I want people like Sophia, people who hesitate but still choose right, to be the new face of this company." That evening, in a closed internal live stream sent to all Global Skies employees, nearly 38,000 across the world, Daniel sat in a simple chair in a quiet conference room. No backdrop, no branding, just a microphone and his word. "If you're watching this," he began, "it means you've heard about what happened on Flight 162. I won't rehash the story. It's already out there. What I want to talk about is what it revealed, not just about a few people, but about us as a company, as a culture, and most importantly, as individuals with power to harm or to heal." If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing content.